Welcome back, everybody, to our fourth deep dive into UAE VAT. We've covered the basics, we've looked at registration, and we've even gotten into the nitty-gritty of input tax. But today, we're tackling the big one, the question that's probably on every business owner's mind. What exactly is taxable in the UAE?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Because let's face it, getting this wrong can have some serious consequences for your business.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking compliance issues, potential penalties,
Yeah.
and missed opportunities to recover that precious input tax.
Right, and no one wants to deal with that headache, so let's break it down. Under the UAE VAT law, everything falls into one of three categories: taxable, exempt, or outside the scope.
It's like sorting your socks, You've got your everyday pairs, the ones you only wear for special occasions, and then those odd socks that you have no idea where they came from.
I love that analogy.
Mm.
And just like with socks, getting your VAT categories mixed up can lead to a whole lot of chaos.
It can, because remember, these categories determine not only if you charge VAT on your supplies, but also if you can reclaim the VAT you've paid on your purchases.
That's the input tax we've talked about before. Okay, so let's start with the most common category: taxable supplies.
Now, the interesting thing here is that the law actually doesn't give you a specific list of what's taxable.
Right.
Nope. It just defines what a taxable supply is.
So how do you know what to charge VAT on?
Basically, unless something is specifically exempt or zero rated, it defaults to being taxable.
So it's guilty until proven innocent.
You could say that. And that's where the standard rate of 5% VAT comes in.
Okay, so let's say I'm walking through one of those massive malls in Dubai.
Right.
Pretty much everything I see is probably subject to that 5% VAT then.
Most likely. Think clothes, electronics, that fancy coffee you're holding.
Yikes, my latte just got more expensive.
Ah.
But hey, at least it helps to know where my money's going.
Exactly. Now, of course, there are those exceptions we mentioned. The zero-rated and exempt supplies. That's where things get a little more strategic.
And potentially a lot more beneficial for certain businesses.
Absolutely. Let's start with zero-rated supplies. Now, this one might seem a bit counterintuitive at first.
How so?
Because even though you're charging 0% VAT on these supplies, you can still recover the input tax you've paid on related expenses.
Well, wait a minute. So I'm not charging my customers any VAT, but I can still get a refund from the government for the VAT I've already paid.
That's the idea.
That sounds like a pretty sweet deal.
It can be, and the UAE uses this strategically to support certain sectors and activities.
Okay, so what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, you've got exports, international transportation, certain healthcare services.
Okay, so a pretty diverse range of industries there.
It is, and for those of you in the real estate world, listen closely, because the first supply of residential buildings within 3 years of completion is also zero-rated.
Now, that's a big one, especially in a market like the UAE, where real estate is such a major player.
Huge implications for developers, investors, and really anyone involved in that sector.
So knowing this little detail could really impact your pricing strategies and cash flow projections.
Absolutely crucial information. Now, on the flip side, we have exempt supplies. This is where no VAT is charged at all.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Well, hold on a second. There's a catch.
Oh, there's always a catch, isn't there?
There is. With exempt supplies, you can't reclaim any of the input tax you've paid.
So no VAT charge to customers, but no VAT refunds for me either.
Exactly. It's a trade-off.
A trade-off that businesses really need to understand before making any decisions.
Absolutely.
So what kinds of things fall into this exempt category?
Well, you've got your financial services for one, bare land, which is always a hot topic here in the UAE, and local passenger transport.
Okay, so again, a pretty wide range of sectors.
It is, and managing that input tax recovery can become a real balancing act for businesses dealing with exempt supplies.
Especially if they're also handling taxable or zero-rated supplies at the same time.
You've got it.
Okay, so we've covered taxable supplies, zero-rated supplies, and exempt supplies. But what about that third category, the one that you compared to those mysterious odd socks?
Yes, outside the scope.
What exactly does that mean?
Well, it's basically a whole other world where VAT just doesn't apply.
Sounds like a nice place to be.
It can be.
Yeah.
But it's not always easy to determine what falls into this category.
So give me some examples. What kinds of things are we talking about here?
Let's say you're selling vouchers at face value, or you're selling your entire business as a going concern. Those transactions would typically be outside the scope of VAT.
Interesting.
And most donations would also fall under this category as long as the donor isn't getting some kind of direct benefit in return.
So it has to be a truly selfless act of giving.
Pretty much.
Now, here's one that I think a lot of business owners will be interested in. What about passive income? Things like interest and dividends from investments.
That's a great question. And in most cases, those types of income would also be outside the scope of VAT.
So if I'm sitting on a pile of passive income, I can breathe a sigh of relief.
You can. It's all about understanding the essence of the transaction. Is there a clear supply of goods or services for consideration? If not, it might just be floating in that VAT-free zone.
I like the sound of that VAT-free zone.
It's a good place to be. But remember, this is just a general overview. The real challenge is knowing how to apply these categories to your specific business and its transactions.
And that's where things can get a little bit tricky. But don't worry, we're going to dive into some real-world scenarios and examples in our next segment to help you figure out how to navigate this VAT maze.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.
Okay, so let's get practical here. Let's say I'm a business owner, and I'm selling, I don't know, how about high-tech hydroponic gardening systems? Those are pretty trendy these days, right?
They are. So how do we figure out the VAT treatment for these hydroponic systems?
Well, that's what I'm asking you.
All right, so step one. We need to make sure this hydroponics even fall within the scope of UAE VAT.
Seems obvious, but I bet you'd be surprised how many people skip this step.
You'd be amazed. It's like checking if you're on the right playing field before you start worrying about the rules of the game.
Okay, so let's assume our hydroponics are definitely in the game.
Great. Now we move on to the exempt list. Are hydroponic systems specifically mentioned as exempt in the UAE VAT law?
I'm going to guess no.
You're right, they're not. So on to the next step. Zero-rated supplies. Do those hydroponics fit into any of the categories we talked about earlier?
Exports, international transport, healthcare, residential buildings. Nope, doesn't sound like it.
Okay, so that leaves us with one option.
Standard rated.
Bingo. Assuming your business is registered for VAT, you're looking at adding that 5% on top of the price of your hydroponic systems.
See, that's a process of elimination. But I'm sure it's not always this straightforward.
You're right, there are definitely some tricky situations.
Like what?
Well, how about compensation payments, for example?
Yeah, I can see how those could be a bit confusing.
It really depends on the nature of the payment.
So like if I get reimbursed for a damaged shipment, that's probably not taxable.
Right, because there's no actual supply of goods or services happening in that situation.
It's just making up for a loss.
Exactly.
But what if I have to pay a cancellation fee for a hotel booking?
That's a different story, because in that case, the hotel is still providing a service, even if it's just holding that room for you.
So the cancellation fee would be subject to VAT.
Most likely. And the same goes for any payments made to enforce a contractual term, like settling a dispute over the price of goods, for example.
Got it. So it's not just about the word compensation. It's about what the payment is actually for.
Exactly.
Now, what about donations, grants, scholarships, things like that?
That's where things get a little bit more nuanced.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The key here is to look at the intention behind the payment.
Intention, okay.
If there's no clear benefit that the payer receives in return, it's generally considered outside the scope of VAT.
So a straight-up donation to a charity, no VAT. Right. But what if I make a donation to, say, a big industry conference, and in return they give me a huge booth to promote my business?
Well, in that case, it starts to look a lot more like a business transaction than a charitable donation.
Because I'm getting something in return.
Exactly. So that payment would likely be considered a supply of advertising services and subject to VAT.
Sneaky, sneaky.
Got to watch out for those hidden benefits.
Okay, so once again, it's about looking beyond the label and really understanding the true nature of the transaction.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And documentation is key here.
Absolutely. You need to be able to justify your V treatment if the authorities ever come knocking.
Paper trails, paper trails. Now, what about those businesses with multiple entities?
Intragroup transactions.
Yeah, those can get pretty complicated.
They can, but thankfully VAT groups can help to simplify things.
Okay, tell me more about this.
If you have a VAT group registration, supplies between members of the group are essentially ignored for VAT purposes.
So if my company in Dubai sells products to my subsidiary in Abu Dhabi, and we're both part of the same VAT group, no VAT on that transaction.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a pretty big advantage.
It is. It streamlines accounting and reporting significantly.
But I'm guessing there are some strict requirements to qualify for a VAT group.
There are. It's not just a free-for-all.
Okay, good to know. Now let's move on to something a bit more straightforward. Employee services.
That's a nice easy one.
Lay it on me.
Services provided by employees to their employer are not considered a supply for VA purposes.
So all that hard work my team puts in, all those late nights and brilliant ideas, VAT free.
That's the general principle. It's a fundamental part of how VA is designed to work.
Music to my ears.
Now, what about those folks sitting on boards of directors?
Ah, good question. Are their services considered taxable?
It's interesting, actually. The UAE VAT law specifically states that the functions of a board member, even a non-resident, are not considered a supply for VAT
So
purposes.
all those board meetings, no matter how heated they get, are happening in a VAT-free zone.
That's right.
I bet some board members wish all their expenses were treated that way.
I'm sure they do. It's a unique aspect of the law and one that's worth highlighting for our listeners.
Agreed. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. Compensation payments, donations, intragroup transactions, employee services, board members. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's all crucial information for businesses operating in the UAE.
So let's do a quick recap just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Okay, so let's rewind for a sec. We started by talking about the three main categories of supplies under UAE VA law. Taxable, exempt, outside the scope.
And we really stressed how those categories aren't just about charging VAT. They also play a big part in whether you can recover input tax.
Right, and then we went through each category with real examples, stuff that our listeners, the business owners and finance folks out there can actually use.
Yeah.
So we looked at standard rated supplies, which are basically your everyday transactions. Then we talked about zero rated supplies, where there's some real strategic planning to be done.
And of course, exempt supplies, where you got to be careful about managing that input tax recovery.
Yeah, and we even ventured into the mysterious land of outside the scope. Transactions that basically get a free pass from VAT.
Right. We talked about some tricky situations, compensation payments, donations,
Yeah.
those intragroup transactions. It all comes down to understanding the true nature of the transaction to figure out the correct VAT treatment.
Exactly. Oh, and we can't forget about those special cases, like employee services and the work of board members. Turns out those are VAT-free zones.
Yeah, it's all about those little nuances.
It really is. But hey, we've covered a ton of ground today.
We have, but this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to UAE VAT.
So true. The landscape is always changing.
It is. But the important thing is to stay informed and be aware of the basics.
Exactly. You don't have to be a VA expert.
Yeah.
But knowing where to find reliable information and when to ask for help is crucial.
Absolutely. The UAE VAT Authority has a ton of resources available, guides, clarifications, all sorts of helpful stuff.
And if you're looking for some more personalized guidance, some one-on-one help with your specific situation, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, leave a comment below with your questions or consultation requests. Our team will do our best to connect you with a qualified VAT consultant.
We're here to help you navigate the world of UAE VAT. But before we wrap up, a quick legal disclaimer. The information we've shared today is for general knowledge purposes only. It's not professional advice. Always, always, always consult with a qualified professional for advice that's tailored to your specific situation.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, folks, that's it for today's deep dive into UAE VAT. We'll be back soon with another episode exploring a different aspect of this fascinating and ever-evolving world. Until then, stay informed, stay compliant, and stay profitable.
We'll see you next time.